Hi everybody, I'm Kate Pankhurst, the children's book author and illustrator, and it's absolutely brilliant to be talking to you today at the Pontypridd Children's Book Festival. So I'm going to tell you a little bit more about my books and what I do. Sorry I can't be with you in person at the moment, but I hope this video is full of inspiration for you as we learn a bit more about the fantastically great women who changed the world and made history, saved the planet and worked wonders. So I'll leave you now and pass you over to my session where you're going to do a bit of drawing and learn about the job of a children's book illustrator and writer and about some amazing women from history. Hi everyone, it's Kate here. I'm here today to do the session with you that I would normally do if I could come into your school and meet you in person. But it's really great to be able to come to you through your computer screens to celebrate books and reading and storytelling and to share with you a bit about my job and what I do. So obviously I'm an illustrator and an author. I say it in that order because I trained to be an illustrator. So I went and did a degree in drawing pictures and coming up with ideas for stories. And then I've come to writing my own books from reading lots and lots of children's books that I was the illustrator for, and also just because I love children's books. And yeah, so I got into writing and illustrating my own books. I'm really lucky. I get to work here, which is Sunnybank Mill, which is in Leeds. I'll just give you a quick pan around my studio space. We've got a sofa over there that's really good to sit on and think of ideas. I've also got a massive plant that's gone a bit crazy in lockdown there and has grown lots of new tentacles, branches, and a nice view out of the window there. So there's lots of other artists that share the space up here. So if you hear any noises in the background, that's probably one of my fellow studio holders. And I get to come up here most days and think of ideas for stories and to illustrate books and write my own books. So I'm going to tell you a bit about how I got into what I do, a bit about the books I do, and we're also going to do a bit of drawing together as well. So if you haven't got a pencil and a piece of paper already, or a pen, anything that you like to draw with, you can pause the video a little bit later on and I'll tell you when it's time to run off and get your drawing materials. So before then, I've got some screens, a PowerPoint to show you, so you can see some of the pictures that I'm talking about. So I'm just going to put my slides up. Let's see how to do that. Share this. Right, so you should be able to see the slides that I'm going to show you now. See if I can, whoop, there we go, click on there. So here's a picture of another place in the studio, and this is a picture of my dog Olive, who I haven't brought in with me today to show you because she barks quite a bit, so you probably have your video interrupted with lots of loud annoying dog barks if she was here, but I do bring Olive to work with me most days when I'm working up here. And Olive is a really important part of my job because she gives me lots of inspiration. I don't know if anybody here ever finds themselves getting stuck when they're trying to write a story. If that sounds like you, don't worry, because that happens to me on a daily basis. I think things like, oh, my work's not good enough, this idea I come up with is a bit rubbish, what am I going to do? And I'll sit staring at a blank piece of paper thinking I'm never going to think of a good idea again. And I think that happens to most people actually, whether you're in primary school, whether you're a professional writer. And one of the ways that I find to get myself unstuck is to maybe just watch Olive for a bit and draw some pictures of her, which kind of gets my imagination going, or and that is because Olive does a lot of stupid things, a lot of kind of quite silly and entertaining things like stealing people's sandwiches and just generally rolling about on the floor and being daft. But if I get really stuck, I'll go outside and just have a bit of a change of scene, which I think is incredibly important at the moment, isn't it? Going outside, getting some fresh air, watching Olive have a good run around. I find that kind of frees up my imagination if it's a bit stuck. And when I come back to try and do some work, I find my brain just switches itself back on again. So that's Olive. I don't know if any of you here have ever read The Beano. So I know that Dennis the Menace is on CBBC, isn't he? And the way Dennis the Menace looks today is a little bit different to this version of The Beano, which was, this version of The Beano was much more like what The Beano was like when I was young. And I'd say The Beano was probably played quite a big role in how I've ended up doing this job today. So I used to rush out, I was a big Beano fan, and I'd rush out when the Beano came out on a Thursday, and it used to sometimes come with like a toffee bar sellotaped to the front of it, and I'd run off to the newsagents, get my copy of the Beano and bring it home. And I used to use that to come up with ideas for my own comics. So I was a big fan of one of the comic strips in the Beano called The Bash Street Kids, which was about a group of really naughty school children who were really quite nasty to their teacher, but I found it hilarious, and I used to do my own versions of the Beano. And I think that kind of level of detail and putting loads of different things on a page, that's something that I still try and do today. And then I think comics are just a really good way into storytelling, because you can tell the story in pictures and then add bits of text here and there, and it's not that overwhelming feeling of, oh, I've got to fill a blank page full of writing. You can use your pictures to help you start your stories. And that's something that I do quite often, actually. I'll start, even if I'm writing a story, I'll start with the pictures first. So I'll start with the Fantastically Great Women books that I'm going to talk to you about in a minute. They're non-fiction books about real people from history, but I still kind of have to look at lots of reference material and design a character based on the images that I found of them online, and turn them into an interesting, exciting character. And I'll start with that and get to know them, draw them in lots of different positions. And then before I know it, the words come once I've got the pictures. So as an illustrator, I'd always start with the pictures for my stories. Another really important part of being an illustrator, even if you're working on a book and you've got to do your finished pages for the book, I think it's really important to find time every day to doodle. So this is something I'm struggling to find the time to do every day at the moment, because I've got young children and they're at home and we're really busy every day. But if I do just grab a pencil and do a quick sketch of what my children are doing, or like I said before, what Olive is doing, I find it just makes my brain click into that kind of more playful mode where you can think of really good ideas for stories. And I'd say it kind of changes your outlook on the day, really. If you've got your headspace into that kind of playful, looking for ideas sort of setting, I think it brings a bit of creativity and positivity to your day. So I always try and carry a sketchbook or a bag with some paper and pencils in, so I can do some very, very quick doodles when I'm on the go. So I've got a couple of examples of that. If I come over here, some quick sketches that I did. So these just happen to be pinned up in my studio, and they're actually from last year when I was on a train going to a book event, and they're just some interesting people that I saw in the train station, and I just did very, very quick sketches without worrying too much about them being polished, finished works of art. I think if you start a drawing thinking it's got to be perfect, almost inevitably it won't be perfect. You'll make a little tiny mistake, or something you think is a big mistake, at the start of the drawing, and you'll want to give up and not carry it on. Whereas doodling is a bit more free, so it doesn't really matter if it's a bit wonky. In fact, it's actually probably better if your drawing is a bit wonky and it has a bit of personality, and it's just something you do quickly without getting completely bogged down in this idea that you have to do a perfect drawing. And before you know it, if you spent a few minutes doodling, some ideas might emerge that you never even knew were locked away in your imagination. So I'd say now is the perfect time, actually, to get a sketchbook. And maybe if you're out on your walk or out in the playground in school, you could do like a quick doodle and store that away, and you never know when it might come in handy as inspiration for a story. So talking about inspiration for stories, This is the series of books that I've been working on the past few years, the Fantastically Great Women series of books. And the idea for this book, for this series of books, came from a few different jigsaw puzzle pieces, I suppose. The reason why these books are about women in particular is because there's so many stories of incredible women from history who faced, you might know already that women in the past faced all sorts of challenges. So people thought that women couldn't be explorers, couldn't be adventurers, couldn't be scientists, that they shouldn't have the vote, and that they maybe shouldn't be a hot air balloonist. But the women who were in these books were some pioneers who showed that they had every right to follow their dreams and talents and stand up for what they believed in. And by doing that, they changed the world, made history, worked wonders. And the most recent book in that picture book series is called Saved the Planet. So that's why the books focus on women's stories. But I'd say these are books that boys and girls are going to enjoy equally, because they are stories of adventure and intrigue and being incredibly inspiring and overcoming difficulties. So another reason for doing these books, it is linked back to my name, which is Pankhurst. So I don't know if anybody who is watching this has heard of a famous Pankhurst from history. You may have done. So I'm going to flick forward onto this slide. Does anybody here recognise this lady? She lived kind of over 100 years ago now. And that's a picture of her two daughters, Christabel and Sylvia, in the middle, holding a Votes for Women sign. And this woman's name was Emmeline Pankhurst. So I do share a surname with Emmeline, and I'm quite proud to say that I am a little tiny bit related to Emmeline. So growing up, I'd always known a bit about her story. So Emmeline was a suffragette, or she led a group of women called the suffragettes, and she campaigned to have a change in the law so that women would be allowed to vote. Because over 100 years ago, people thought very strange things. They thought that incredibly silly things, or they seem silly today, things like women, their brains are too small to handle voting, because it's a big responsibility, and if we give them the vote, their brains will implode, or they'll make really terrible decisions about who's going to run the country. They also thought incredibly daft things like, if we give women the vote, they'll stop marrying and they won't have babies and the human race will die out. So obviously all those things are untrue, and Emmeline was a real pioneer and trailblazer and said that of course women should have a vote. They make up 50% of the population in most countries, and of course they should have a say in who runs that country and makes decisions about laws that are going to affect women's lives and everyone's lives in the country. So Emmeline led the way and said, votes for women. People didn't really listen to the debates about women getting the vote, so she called for deeds, not words. And that meant the suffragettes going out and doing some quite, I suppose, like scandalous and outrageous things to draw attention to the Votes for Women campaign. So there's lots of information out there about the suffragettes today. It was a real honour to put Emmeline in my first book. Sorry, I should say how I am a little bit related to her. Growing up, we didn't think we were related to her, but then my auntie looked into our family tree and she discovered that Emmeline was my great-great-grandfather's brother's son's wife. So it's a little bit tenuous, but there is that connection there, which was really exciting. So even though I can't say that I have suffragette blood running in my veins, I can say that I've always known a bit about Emmeline's story, even from childhood. And I think the stories that you know about when you're young, the more inspiring stories you can read about, they definitely do seep into your imaginations. And for me, and for lots of other people actually, it's come out as a surprising bit of inspiration when I was older, in the form of doing these books and kind of having that theme about telling the stories of inspiring, empowering women in these books. But growing up, there wasn't the source of information. There wasn't any books like the ones that I've made to share with you today. I had kind of quite dry encyclopedias about history. So I had to get my information sources from somewhere about the suffragettes. And the main place I got my information from was this film. Does anybody know what picture this film is from? A few of you might be saying Mary Poppins, and you would be right. So next time you watch Mary Poppins, it's on TV quite often at Easter and at Christmas and different bank holidays. There's a scene quite near the beginning of the film where Mrs. Banks skips into the house wearing this pale blue dress with a yellow ruff, and she sings a song called Sister Suffragette. And that song, on the kind of first listen, it sounds quite jolly and happy, and she skips into the house wearing her sash that says Votes for Women. So I thought being a suffragette looked like jolly good fun, and that must be what suffragettes did. But actually, I touched upon this when I introduced Emmeline a moment ago. Emmeline called for deeds, not words, because people weren't listening to this idea that women should have the vote. And deeds, not words, meant the suffragettes carrying out some quite shocking deeds, such as chaining themselves to the railings outside important buildings. They also disrupted political speeches, they smashed windows, and they also did quite shocking things like running into art galleries and slashing paintings. And the reason they did those things was so that people couldn't ignore their message. They weren't listening to words, so people couldn't ignore the deeds that the suffragettes were carrying out. So that's been quite an eye-opener as I've got older. There is a lot more information out there about the suffragettes now, and I'm sure there's lots of other things that you can learn about them, and the kind of quite surprising things that these women did to get a change in the law and get votes for women, which thankfully today, thanks to women like Emmeline and the suffragettes, we do have the vote. So the other bit of inspiration to do these books, going back to the idea of doodling. So doodling, you might do a picture one day and not realise that it's the missing piece of a jigsaw puzzle for another problem that you're going to face later on. So I was working on this book, which is Mariella Mystery Investigates the Curse of the Pampered Poodle. And that's all about a weird cursed poodle that sits in a museum gathering dust. Anyway, that's another story. But one of the characters in the book was called Lady Winkleton. And I don't know if by looking at her, you can guess who I used, a real life woman who I used as inspiration for that character. So the woman that I used as inspiration for Lady Winkleton was Amelia Earhart. So if you don't know already, Amelia Earhart was the first woman to fly solo across the Atlantic Ocean at a time where people thought the idea of a woman taking on such an incredible adventure was completely preposterous and that she'd never be able to do it. She showed everybody that, of course, a woman could have this amazing adventure, fly across the Atlantic and make it from Canada to, she was meant to fly to Paris, but actually had to crash land in Londonderry in Northern Ireland. So I think looking at those pictures of Amelia Earhart in this like really intriguing aviator pilot's costume, I got very interested in who she was, and I used her as inspiration for Lady Winkleton. But then that set me off on a whole different pathway where I wanted to learn more about Emmeline, and I could imagine telling her story in a visual format with the map and Emmeline and her bright red plane, and she did actually fly a bright red plane. I could just see what that illustration was going to look like. So I joined up those two bits of the puzzle, Emmeline's story, who was a fantastically great woman, and also being a Pankhurst, and came up with the idea for this series of books about fantastically great women from history. So I'm going to tell you a bit about the latest book in the series and introduce you to some of the women from that book. But this book is about women who did a particular type of job. They had a particular type of interest. And to give you a clue about what that interest might be, I have some items that I'd normally make you wear if I came into your school and did an assembly, but I'm going to wear them instead. So if you were doing this job, you might wear a coat a bit like this one. Put it on. Nice kind of white coat. Don't know if that gives you any ideas. I'll just flick off here so you can see me in more detail. There we go. I've got my nice white coat on. You might have a pair of these, which are some safety goggles. There we go. You might have a bit of equipment in front of you, like, what have we got here? Let me open this. A strange beaker. You might be doing some experiments. I've got a few beakers here. Any guesses what job this person might have done? It might look quite obvious now. I've got some nice pipettes. Bit of an experiment going on there. Yes, you are right. This book is about scientists. So this is Fantastically Great Women, Scientists and Their Stories. And this is a bit different to the other books that I've worked on. The other books are picture books. So it's got one spread with a really detailed coloured picture about each woman. Whereas this book is about 8 different female scientists. And it's a chapter book. So it goes into much more detail about these women's lives, and it's full of loads and loads of really detailed black and white illustrations. So dressed as a scientist, I think this is traditionally what you think of when you think of science and experiments. But actually, there's lots of different types of scientists in this book who don't just wear a get-up like this. So there was Marie Curie. And I'm going to put my PowerPoint back on so I can show you some of the women that are in this book. Put this back on. So you should be able to see that slide again. So here is Fantastically Great Women, Scientists and Their Stories. And these are the women that feature in the book. So you have women like Marie Curie, who discovered 2 new radioactive elements. I'm going to introduce you to her and her story in a bit more detail in a minute. You also get scientists that are volcanologists that look at geology. That's Katia Kraft. I'll introduce you to her in a bit more detail as well. There is Mae Jemison, the first African-American woman to go into space and become an astronaut. Elizabeth Blackwell, who was the first woman to train as a doctor and actually work as a doctor at a time where women were told, you definitely can't do that profession. The idea of a woman looking at somebody's body was absolutely shocking and disgusting to people. They couldn't get their heads around it. And we also have incredible women like Tu Youyou, the Chinese chemist, who developed a cure for malaria, an effective treatment for malaria. And the story of how she developed that new medicine only came to light really, really recently in history. So it's great to kind of put her story in the book. There's also incredible women like Janaki Amol, the Indian botanist, who very quietly went about making amazing scientific discoveries, looking at the DNA of plants to create new species of plants or new hybrids of plants, and do really practical things like make Indian sugarcane sweeter to change, to make hybrids of Indian sugarcane so they were less reliant on imports from other countries. And then Caroline Herschel, who in the 1700s became the first ever professional astronomer. So I think I've introduced all of them, apart from Rosalind Franklin, who is also in the picture books, who took a very important photograph called Photograph 51 of the structure of DNA. And her story is very intriguing because this amazing contribution and this very important photograph that she took, her contribution to the discovery of the structure of DNA was very much overlooked at the time by the men who took all the glory for the discovery of DNA. But it was only kind of later on that we discovered how important Rosalind Franklin's photograph was. So I'm going to take off my scientist outfit now to introduce you to the rest of the women. who are in this book, or just delve a bit deeper into a few of their stories. So we have here, this is a picture of Marie Curie. So this is from the picture book spread that I did of Marie Curie. So this is what the spreads look like before they've had the type put over the top of the image. And Marie Curie discovered, she was very interested in early X-rays. So another scientist had identified that there was a weird ray that was given off by certain elements or substances, and that allowed you to take photographs of it passed through skin and flesh and allowed you to take pictures of solid objects like bone. So Marie Curie was very intrigued by that, and she explored the rays that other substances emitted, and she discovered two brand new elements called radium and polonium, and those two new elements gave off a strange ray that she described. She was the first person to describe this as radioactivity, and the elements that she discovered played a massive role in changing the way that we treat cancer today. So that's her spread from the picture book. I could only touch upon some of the incredible things that she did, and I really enjoyed doing this spread because radium, which is one of the elements that she discovered, gives off a green glow, a strange green glow. So Marie Curie slept with a jar of radium next to her bed as a nightlight because it gave off a green glow. What she didn't know was that that was actually quite dangerous and it causes all sorts of health problems. But that's all I could touch upon in the picture book spread, and I gave her a green face on this kind of radioactive spread. So it was really lovely in the chapter books to be able to delve a bit deeper into Marie Curie's life. So she did an enormous amount of scientific work with her husband, Pierre Curie, and together they won a Nobel Prize for their work researching the rays given off by radium and polonium. So that was a nice, in the book, I'll show you a picture from the book actually if I can find their spread. I kind of put this picture of Marie Curie and her husband Pierre gazing at each other across the page. So there's a bit of, can't hold that up in front of the camera. There's a bit of text in the middle of them in the book. Another thing that we could delve in a bit deeper was this idea that people thought that radium, which was discovered by Marie Curie and her husband, was a wonder substance that could cure everything. So they used to put it in perfume, in tonic, in chocolate. You could buy toys painted with radium paint so they glowed in the dark. And then people worked in radium factories, but nobody realised that it was actually incredibly dangerous stuff, and you really shouldn't put it in chocolate because it would make you quite ill. So Marie Curie as well, it was great to include details that in World War I, she was responsible for encouraging the French government to set up mobile radiology units, which were vans called Petit Curies, and she drove around taking mobile radiology units to take x-rays to help injured soldiers on the battlefield. So all those things I couldn't put in the picture book, it's been great to put into the longer chapter book, because that's the thing that takes so long with the picture books, is deciding what to chop out of these women's lives and what to focus on if there's only going to be one page about them. Another woman who we've not put in the picture books yet, but if I do any further picture books about the fantastically great women, I think she definitely needs to go in. This is Mae Jemison, who I mentioned before, the first African-American woman to fly into space. And really shockingly, actually, I discovered that this mission only happened very recently. It happened in, let me find the page in the book, 1992. Mae stepped on board the Space Shuttle Endeavour and prepared herself for a big adventure. So I found that remarkable, actually, that the first Black woman in space, that only happened really recently. But the really intriguing things about Mae's story included in her childhood, a lot of the things that she was interested in as a child all kind of joined together in a big jigsaw of what she was going to end up doing as an adult. So she was really intrigued by science, did a whole school project about pus and like what pus was and what effect that had on the human body. She was also a really talented dancer and did lots and lots of different type of dance. And she was also a bit of a fashion designer. So she loved watching Star Trek. And in the 60s and 70s, she watched Star Trek when it had its one of the first leading black women to be on screen, was the actress who played Uhura in Star Trek, and they found her a real inspiration. And then who knew it, as she went on as an adult, she went into space and kind of lived this amazing life, reaching for the stars and actually getting there. So May used a lot of those childhood talents in her job as an astronaut. So here's a page from the book. So we still kind of use lots of the design elements that you get in the picture book. So kind of having a spread where the NASA Endeavour is shooting off into the sky. And if any of you have ever seen the film, I can't remember what it's called now. It's about the women of NASA who, called Dorothy Vaughan and Catherine Johnson, who were black women who worked for NASA in the early days of NASA and paved the way for all these incredible things to happen. The moon landing, for the first man in space. These women played an important part of that story, but were completely overlooked until very recently. So there's this wonderful picture of Mae Jemison, going back to that childhood talent she had for dancing. There's an amazing picture of her, a real life picture of her floating in zero gravity, where it looks like she's dancing in space. And she talks about the incredible experience of being in zero gravity. So it's great to do this picture from the chapter books of her dancing and floating around in zero gravity. Oh. So going back to lots of different areas of science and scientists. So it's not just about wearing lab coats and doing scientific experiments. This was Katia Kraft, who was a volcanologist, and she was I put her in the picture books and just touched upon some of the incredible things that she did. So she loved volcanoes. Here's a picture of her from the chapter books, and she's wearing a t-shirt that says, "I love volcanoes." She was really intrigued in them as a child and wanted to go on holiday to see Etna and Stromboli, which are very active volcanoes in the world. And she, along with her husband, Maurice Kraft, travelled the world seeking out all the information they could about live active volcanoes. So she would get a call to say a volcano was erupting, or it had shown signals that it might erupt, and she'd travel there with her husband to very, very dangerous situations to study volcanoes and get really close to them, so that she could learn more about how and when volcanoes erupt, what happens when they do. And all that information was really important to countries with active volcanoes, and it helped them figure out what they were going to do if a volcano erupted to evacuate people and to save lives. So there's a really amazing picture of Katia Kraft walking along. Oh, I should have put it on this slide. I've not put it on. If you have a look on the internet, there's a really amazing picture of her, which I've illustrated here, of her walking along with a massive fountain of lava shooting up behind her, fiery red lava, and she's just strolling along in her protective volcanologist's costume there. Another picture that another bit of their story that I could just touch upon in the picture books. It's this kind of picture of the inside of a volcano and Katia Kraft leaning in on a ledge. She and Maurice Kraft actually camped inside at the crater of an active volcano and studied it for days and days on end. So in the chapter book, I drew a picture of Maurice Kraft hanging out his socks as they overlooked a pool of bubbling lava. So she does say in one of the diaries that I read that she'd written a piece of information, it said if the lava flow had surged even like a few centimetres higher, it would have engulfed the platform they were on and would have led to a terrible fiery death. But she still went and did these things, which was absolutely incredible. Yes, it's been absolutely brilliant to share the stories in more detail of these incredible scientists from history. Yeah, so have a little look at those books if you get a chance. And I hope you enjoyed listening to the stories of these women so far, and I think it is time now to do a bit of drawing. I've been talking for long enough. Hopefully you haven't fast forwarded me too much and I haven't been too boring. And I'm just going to switch the view of the camera. So if you want to pause this and go and grab a pencil, do that now. And we're going to draw one of these women from history together. So I think I've heard really recently about the new mission to Mars, about a spacecraft from this planet landing on Mars that's sending back all sorts of incredible pictures from that planet. So I think it would be a great idea to draw Mae Jemison for our doodle together. So we're going to do it step by step. So don't feel that you've got to race ahead. If you make a mistake, don't worry, we can turn that into part of our drawing. Don't get too hung up on it being perfect. So when I write books, you have to the first version of what you write isn't generally what ends up in the book. You have to go back and rewrite it and edit it and add bits in to make it more interesting. The same is true of a drawing. So if you don't get it right first time, it's absolutely fine. Just carry on and get to the end of your drawing. And if you get to the end of it, a lot of the time, the things that you thought were a massive mistake, like one eye being bigger than the other or something like that, don't matter at all. It just makes a really interesting picture. So stop sharing that and we'll swap. So I can put a video of what I'm drawing. Just let me switch over to that. Video. There we go. Share screen, iPad. There we go. So that should swap over so you can see a screen of what I'm drawing and me in the corner. Okay, so the first thing I'm going to do, which I find really useful when I start sketching out a character, I'm going to have a little think about like roughly the shape of the body and where I want the major bits to be. So I'm just going to do a really, really faint outline here. Quite a large circle that's going to be Mae Jemison's space helmet. Then I'm also going to add in like a rough shape of her body. And all that's going to do is just provide a little map so I can figure out what's going to go where. So the first thing I usually do with my drawings is to start off with the character's eyes. So I'm going to do Mae Jemison's eyes, and we're going to draw her floating in zero gravity. So I'm going to do her eyes and her nose. There we go. I think she's going to be looking pretty chuffed about being the first African-American woman in space. So we've got her facial features there. She's looking quite cheerful. And the next bit I'm going to do is the visor on her space helmet. So we're not going to do the full shape of the space helmet just yet. I'm going to draw that bit around there. So there's the visor looking out. So we're going to build this up step by step. Going to do the side of her face there. And just a few kind of wisps of hair, so we get a sense that there's a head inside that helmet. And then eyebrows are super important when you're doing a character. They add loads of emotion. So I'm just going to do one eyebrow up, And one eyebrow down. Maybe that makes her look a bit curious about something she's seen off out of the window of her spacecraft. And then to add a bit of skin tone, what I'm going to do, I'll show you what I'm doing in this bottom corner of my sketchbook. Scribbling with my pencil. Get a nice soft pencil to do this. I might need a bit of a softer one actually. What I'm going to do, you can take your finger and just rub your finger over that soft pencil. And I'm just going to add in a bit of skin tone. There you go. So you don't need loads and loads of complicated equipment. So keep rubbing. We'll do some like slightly darker bits on her cheeks to make give her face a bit of shape. And then the next bit I'm going to do is her space helmet. So if we draw around here, do a nice big circle around here. The neck of her space helmet there. I think because it was a NASA mission, we could write NASA on there, definitely. There we go. So we're going to do her dancing in zero gravity. So I'm going to do one hand coming down here. Maybe her hands in an astronaut's glove, a space glove. And do her body coming down like this. I think the key is in the detail as well. So I looked at lots of pictures of what Mae Jemison wore in space. So the more details you can add in, like the logo on her helmet. Oh, maybe add in another device on her helmet so it would actually open if it was a real helmet. So then I think we'll have this other hand coming up here as if she is floating in space. And that hand could be holding a jar with, it's going to have a tadpole inside it. Because one of the experiments that Mae did in space was to study tadpoles to see if they developed in the same way as they did on Earth in space. So she had some space traveling tadpoles, which later became frogs with her on her mission. I think as she's floating, we'll just have like one leg coming down here like this. We're going to have her in a spacesuit, so it's going to be quite a baggy trouser leg with her leg coming up here. There we go. One leg there, and then the other leg kind of kicking down and out like this one. Do some stitching on the spacesuit. Then do her other space boot coming down like this. A bit more stitching on there. And we could just add in a few more details, like a few stars in the background, a few sketches of planets, because this is just a very quick doodle of Mae Jemison together. Right, so everybody has their own way of drawing, and however you draw, the thing that makes illustrators unique and recognizable is that they have their own style of drawing. So if yours looks a little bit different to this one, that is absolutely fine. It just means that you've drawn it in your own illustrator style. So I'm going to add in that it says Mae Jemison. A little arrow here. Mae Jemison, first African-American woman to go into space. And I'm going to finish off by reading you a quote, actually, from the book. And I find this a really inspiring quote, and it's what Mae said about being the first Black woman to go into space. So she said, "I am not the first woman of colour, the first African-American woman who had the skills, the talent, the desire to be an astronaut. I happen to be the first one that NASA selected." So she was saying there was lots of other people out there with the skills and abilities to allow them to do this. It was just that she was at the right point in history where she was the first to be selected. And I really like the final page of Mae's story. So if I flick off my drawing, if we flick here, so this is the final page from the book, and it says Mae's mission across the top, and it tells the story about how today she runs space camps for children interested in space to help get them involved in the subject and to help them think about how they're going to find the answers to some of the world's big scientific questions. So that's the end of the session. I hope you found it enjoyable. If you have done any pictures of Mae Jemison or any other women from the books that you'd like to send through to me, I'd love to see them. And yeah, thank you for listening. It was lovely to meet you virtually at home or in school.